The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in October 1906, the kind of morning when even the gas lamps in Sarah May Whitfield's Charleston boarding house flickered as though they feared the coming winter. She had been sipping her breakfast tea, trying to ignore the ache that always settled in her chest when autumn returned, an ache tied to memories she had worked tirelessly to bury. When the landlady slipped an envelope beneath her door, Sarah May instantly recognized the handwriting on its surface. Martha Henley, her childhood friend, the only familiar face left in Blackwater Hollow whom she trusted. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. The moment her eyes fell upon the inked words, a coldness gripped her that had nothing to do with the draft slipping through the old parlor windows. "Sarah May, you must come home at once. Cordelia Thorne has returned to Blackwater Hollow, and the town has gone mad with fear and rage. They say she killed her husbands with unnatural practices, that she drove them to madness with her deviant appetites before sending them to their graves. 3 dead men in 4 years, and now she walks among us again like some cursed specter. The church bells haven't stopped ringing since Sunday. Reverend Patterson has preached 3 sermons in as many days. All fire, brimstone, and warnings that Babylon walks among us in the shape of a young woman. But something about this feels wrong, Sarah May. Wrong in a way I cannot put into words. The town is ready to kill her. Please come home. I fear what they might do to her." Sarah May read the letter twice, then a third time, though the words hardly changed. Martha's desperate handwriting seemed to waver on the page, as if the ink itself were trembling. A tightness spread through Sarah May's chest, a familiar dread she had worked hard to silence since leaving the mountains behind. Cordelia Thorne, the cursed Appalachian bride, the whispered monster of Blackwater Hollow. 3 husbands dead before she turned 25. Women in the church crossed themselves when they heard her name. Men spat into the dirt and claimed she brought the devil into their homes. But Sarah May remembered another Cordelia, the quiet girl who taught children in Sunday school, the one with gentle hands and soft eyes. A girl who had vanished from town gossip long before she became a legend of wickedness. Closing the letter, Sarah May felt the past rise around her like a fog. She had fled Blackwater Hollow 5 years earlier after her father's mysterious death in what Sheriff Buck Coleman insisted was a mining accident. She had run to Charleston hoping distance would weaken grief's hold. It never had, and now the mountains were calling her back, dragging her towards secrets she had not been ready to face. The truth behind Cordelia's curse. The truth behind her father's final weeks. The truth behind a town that swallowed inconvenient voices whole. Sarah May folded the letter, her decision already made. She would return. The train wound northward through the Blue Ridge Mountains like a steel serpent, dragging Sarah May Whitfield deeper into the place she had sworn never to return. She sat stiff, backed in her narrow seat, hands clasped tightly around Martha's letter as though it were an anchor in a churning sea. Outside the window, the world transformed from Charleston's coastal softness into harsh, towering ridges. Mountains that rose like ancient guardians keeping watch over secrets no one dared speak aloud. Autumn had claimed the slopes in full, draping the Appalachians in fiery reds, dying golds, and bruised purples. The trees burned with color, beautiful yet somber, like candles flickering in a cathedral before a funeral. Mist curled between the valleys like ghost breath, lingering in places sunlight seemed afraid to reach. Sarah May felt every mile like a step backward into a memory she had tried desperately to outrun. 5 years had passed since she had fled Blackwater Hollow. 5 years since her father, Reverend James Whitfield, died in what the sheriff called a tragic mining accident. But no matter how many classrooms she taught in, how many children she guided through their lessons, or how many new friends she made in Charleston, a heavy weight had followed her like a shadow, a weight shaped like unanswered questions. Her father had been the town's moral compass, a man who comforted the suffering and confronted the cruel, yet in his final months he had grown tired, died and haunted, troubled by something he never fully explained. And then he was gone, buried quickly, questions dismissed, suspicions silenced, no investigation, no justice, only whispers. Now, Martha Henley's letter had reopened the wound she had tried so hard to close. Cordelia Thorne has returned. Cordelia, the supposedly wicked bride who buried 3 husbands. Cordelia, the woman townsfolk whispered about in trembling tones. Cordelia, the woman whose name filled sermons with warnings of corruption and ungodly appetites. Stories about her had grown like mold in damp corners, dark and foul, but Sarah May remembered another version of her, a soft-spoken girl who sat in the second pew and stitched blankets for winter baptisms. A girl who kept her head down when men spoke too loudly. A girl who vanished in pieces long before gossip named her a monster. The train whistle broke her thoughts, shrill and lonely. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass as the familiar outline of Blackwater Hollow began to take shape. The crooked roofs, the narrow dirt lanes, the looming pines that seemed to swallow the sunlight whole. Blackwater Hollow had always worn a quiet heaviness, but now it felt suffocating, like a room whose windows had been nailed shut. Smoke curled from chimneys in thin, uneasy spirals. People on the platform moved with hurried purpose, avoiding eye contact. The air itself seemed heavy with dread. When the train screeched to a halt and the conductor called her stop, Sarah May stepped down onto the wooden platform. The boards creaked beneath her boots like old bones protesting her return. She took a steadying breath. She was home, but nothing about it felt welcoming. Blackwater Hollow looked almost unchanged from the day Sarah May fled it. Unchanged, yet strangely smaller, as though the years had pressed it inward, wringing out every bit of warmth it once possessed. The same narrow storefronts leaned crookedly along Main Street. The same wooden signs creaked in the mountain wind. The same dust, fine, gray, and unshakable, clung to windowsills and boot heels alike. But beneath the familiar stillness lay a tension thick enough to taste like iron on the tongue. As she walked from the train depot toward the boarding house, she felt eyes on her, furtive, curious, suspicious. Curtains fluttered shut when she passed. Murmured conversations snapped into silence. It was the same uneasy watchfulness she remembered from her childhood, but sharper now, almost fevered. She passed the general store, and that was where she first heard it. Mrs. Petton, with her perpetual frown and sharp little eyes, stood on the porch speaking to another woman. Her voice carried easily in the still morning air. Unnatural acts, Mrs. Petton whispered, as though savoring the scandal. That's what Reverend Patterson said. Poor Isaac Dalton, driven to madness by her wicked ways. A man can only take so much before the devil lays claim to him. A shame, her companion murmured. 3 husbands dead. And each one died screaming, they say. They didn't notice Sarah May passing until she was nearly beside them. When they did, both women stiffened, their chatter falling abruptly silent. Mrs. Petton forced a tight smile. Back for a visit, Miss Whitfield. Sarah May nodded politely, though her pulse quickened. Just a short stay. The other woman's eyes darted toward the woods that bordered the town. Well, mind you don't wander out that way. Evil clings to that old thorn cottage. Reverend Patterson says we must be vigilant. Wickedness returns when we let our guard down. Sarah May inclined her head as though she understood, though inwardly she felt a swirl of unease. The Hollow had always been prone to superstition, but this felt different, more desperate, more venomous. Inside the Widow Preston's boarding house, she found a cold room with a narrow bed and a window facing the dense pines. Widow Preston herself watched her with the look of someone assessing a suspicious package left on her doorstep. You'll keep to yourself, the widow said, handing over a key. No callers after dark, and don't go wandering. The menfolk are on edge these days. Sarah May forced a thin smile. Of course, that night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake listening to the restless sounds of the mountain, the hoot of a screech owl, the creak of old branches shifting in the wind, the faraway cry of some unseen creature. But there were other sounds too, human sounds, the low rumble of men's voices rising from the street, boots crunching on gravel, the muted clatter of bottles, a torch being struck alight. She rose quietly, heart pounding, and crept to the window. A crowd of nearly 20 men had gathered below, faces grim, fists clenched, torches flickering like restless spirits, and at their head stood Sheriff Buck Coleman, jaw set, eyes cold. The sight twisted something inside her. Whatever had brought her home, it was already waiting. Sheriff Buck Coleman stood like a dark pillar at the head of the crowd, torchlight carving deep shadows across his square jaw. Sarah May remembered him well, remembered the heavy boots, the heavier fists, and the way her father's voice would tighten whenever his name was mentioned. Seeing him now, leading a mob through the streets of Blackwater Hollow, she felt a chill settle deep into her bones. "She's a curse on this town," Coleman barked, his voice rising above the murmurs of the men assembled. 3 good Christian men dead, and for what? To satisfy her unnatural hungers. A ripple of agreement passed through the men. Grim nods, muttered prayers, tightening grips on sticks and stones. "The Lord commands us," Coleman continued, raising his torch, "to drive out corruption from among us. Evil festers when decent men stand idle. Not tonight." They moved as a single mass toward the forest path, the narrow trail that led to the old thorn cottage. Sarah May's breath caught. Cordelia lived there alone, isolated, vulnerable. Before she knew it, her cloak was around her shoulders and she was slipping silently from the boarding house, trailing the mob at a careful distance. Every instinct screamed against it, but something stronger, something she could only name as duty, pushed her forward. The forest swallowed them quickly. Dense pines closed overhead, the air turning damp and cold as the men's torches cast jerking shadows across the trees. The mob's muttering grew louder, uglier. Witch, devil's bride, seductress, monster. The words tangled together in a fevered chant that made the hair on Sarah May's arms rise. The thorn cottage appeared suddenly in a small clearing, its sagging roof outlined in silver moonlight. It should have been peaceful, forgotten, just another relic of mountain life, but instead it looked like a wounded creature, too still, too quiet. A faint candle glowed behind the front window. Then a rock shattered the glass. A scream followed, a raw, desperate sound that cut straight through the night. "Leave, witch," someone hollered. "Join your husbands in hell," another shouted. More stones flew, bottles crashed, wood splintered, a chair was hurled through the doorway. The men surged forward, their frenzy growing with every strike, while Sheriff Coleman stood back, arms folded, expression cold and satisfied. This was not justice, this was not fear, this was control, this was punishment. Sarah May pressed herself behind a tree, horror clawing up her throat. She had seen her father write sermons about mercy, compassion, and the dangers of vigilante pride. He had warned her about what could happen when men mistook cruelty for righteousness. Now she was watching it unfold before her eyes. When the mob finally retreated, leaving the cottage in ruins and the clearing littered with broken glass and hateful echoes, Sarah May waited until their torchlight vanished among the pines. Then she stepped forward. The cottage door hung open. Furniture lay overturned. Shards of glass glittered across the floor like scattered ice. The faint candle still flickered on a nearby table. "Hello," Sarah May whispered. "Are you hurt? I want to help." For a moment there was only silence. Then a shadow moved. A figure emerged. Small, trembling, eyes hollow with terror. Cordelia Thorne, but she was no monster. She was broken, bruised, terrified, and hiding from men who were far more dangerous than any rumors ever whispered about her. The storm eased just enough for the trees to stop screaming, but the wind still crawled through the hollows like a living thing. On Ridge Road, the mud had frozen into ridges sharp enough to cut through leather soles, and every few steps the earth gave a hollow sound, as if something beneath it waited to be uncovered. Elias Hart was the first to hear it, a faint tapping like knuckles against wood, coming from the tree line on his left. He stopped, lantern trembling in his hand. "Did y'all hear that?" he whispered. 3 shapes tightened behind him. Jonas Mercer, the deputy, Ruthie Mee Whittaker, who had insisted on coming because her brother was missing, and Thad Bramble, who never said much but carried a shotgun he polished like a newborn child. They all lifted their heads at the same moment. Listening, tap, 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 not frantic, not random, rhythmic, intentional, it's common from the pines. Jonas muttered, gripping his coat tighter, whatever it is. It ain't natural. The lantern light barely reached the first row of trees, but the tapping grew clearer, and then, almost too quiet to catch, a second sound joined it, a slow dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across wet ground. Ruthie swallowed hard. My brother used to tap on the shed door when he wanted me to open it for him. 3 taps, always 3. Elias's jaw tightened. Ruthie, that ain't your brother. Before anyone could stop her, she stepped toward the pines. Ruthie, no. Jonas lunged forward, but too late. She had already crossed into the dark. The others followed, weapons raised, breath fogging in the cold air. Inside the pines, the tapping stopped instantly, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Ruthie, Elias called. No answer. The lantern flickered violently, then steadied. Elias turned slowly in a circle, scanning the black between the trees. The ground here was disturbed, mud torn open as if something big had been dragged through. Pine needles were scattered everywhere, and then lightning flashed far off, illuminating a shape leaning against a tree ahead. Ruthie, or at least her silhouette, but something was wrong. Ruthie, Jonas whispered. She didn't move. The lantern light reached her face. Her eyes were wide, mouth open, frozen in the shape of a scream. Her feet were still planted on the ground, but her upper body leaned forward at an impossible angle, spine bent so far it looked like something had pushed her from behind, and kept pushing until her bones gave way. Her arms were pinned to the tree by 2 long wooden stakes driven through her sleeves and into the bark. But the worst was her hand. Her right hand was extended outward, her index finger tapping the tree, tap, 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 even though she was long dead. Thad dropped his shotgun. Jonas stumbled backward. Elias stepped forward only 1 inch, lantern shaking violently. Because behind Ruthie, carved deep into the tree, were 3 words, "You're next, Elias." Jonas Mercer fell to his knees beside Ruthie Mee's body, hands shaking so violently he could barely keep them from landing in the mud. Elias pulled him back before he could touch her. Something about her posture, about the way her limbs had been forced, arranged, displayed, felt like a warning carved in bone. "Don't," Elias whispered. "Ain't nothing we can do for her now." Jonas covered his face with both hands, a low groan escaping him. "She followed us because of her brother. I told her I'd protect her. God forgive me." Thad Bramble stood a few feet away, his dropped shotgun lying in the dirt like a dead snake. He stared at Ruthie with a blank, eerie calm. "That ain't the work of a man," he murmured. "Not any man I know." Elias raised the lantern higher, scanning the trees. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a stillness that felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath, listening, waiting. He took slow steps around Ruthie's pinned body, careful not to disturb the ground. Something gleamed near her boots. A footprint. No, many footprints, but not human. He crouched, bringing the lantern close. The tracks looked like hooves at first, split in the center, except each print had 5 thin slashes extending from the front, like fingers dragging through mud. The size was wrong too, far too large, each one nearly twice the width of his own boot. They trailed away from Ruthie's body, weaving between the trees, sometimes circling back as if the creature had paced impatiently before arranging her. Jonas rose shakily to his feet. "Elias, what are you looking at?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He followed the prints a few yards deeper into the trees. They twisted, overlapped, disappeared briefly in patches of pine needles, then returned clearer and deeper, as if whatever made them grew more confident the farther it moved from the road. Finally he spoke. "Tracks." Jonas stepped closer. "Bear. No bear I've seen. Look here." Elias pointed at a set frozen in a hardened pool of mud. "Bear paws don't have finger marks like that. And they sure as hell don't walk upright on one side and crawling on all fours the next." Thad spat on the ground. "You're telling us a creature big enough to shape a grown woman like a rag doll is wandering around these woods dragging folks out of their beds?" Elias closed his eyes briefly, an old memory flickering across his mind. whispers he'd heard as a child about the thing in the pines, tales the elders refused to repeat after sunset. He opened his eyes again. "Whatever did this," he said quietly, "ain't new. My pa used to talk about tracks like these showin' up after storms, folks disappearin', bodies found half buried, half burned." Jonas looked at him sharply. "Why ain't you say something earlier?" "Because folks always said it wasn't real." Elias turned, lantern light glinting off the carved words on the tree behind Ruthie. "But now it's callin' me by name." Thunder rumbled far off again, low and angry. The prince led deeper into the forest, moving, circling, taunting, and Elias knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever walked on Ridge Road that night wanted him to follow. Sarah May Whitfield returned from the hollow streets just as the first streaks of gray light cut through the pine canopy. The Thorn cottage lay ahead like a wounded animal, its roof sagging, windows splintered, the front door swinging on broken hinges. Every piece of shattered wood, every shard of glass glittering in the morning sun, seemed to carry the weight of the night's horrors. Yet as she approached, she felt something deeper than fear, an overwhelming sense of injustice, a quiet horror at what the townsfolk had done under the guise of righteousness. She paused at the edge of the clearing, her eyes scanning for Cordelia. Her hands clenched instinctively around the clasp of her cloak. The cottage was silent, almost suspiciously so. The only movement came from a faint flutter of candlelight, still trembling behind the cracked windowpane. "Cordelia," she called softly. "It's Sarah May. I'm here to help." No answer. Just the whisper of wind through the pine needles and the faint scent of smoke lingering from the torches the night before. She stepped forward, careful, each footfall a soft crunch on broken glass. When she reached the front porch, the door groaned in protest as she pushed it open fully. Inside, the cottage smelled of scorched wood, damp earth, and something else, a faint coppery tang that made her stomach twist. Furniture lay overturned. A chair had been thrown across the floor, shards of glass embedded in the threads of a fraying rug. Sarah May moved slowly, every sense alert. "Cordelia," she whispered again, softer this time. A shadow shifted near the far wall. Cordelia stepped forward, pale, disheveled, trembling, clutching a kitchen knife as though it were a talisman. Her dark hair fell in wet strands over bruised cheeks. Her dress, once carefully kept, was torn and dust-streaked. She looked smaller than Sarah May remembered, frail, almost haunted. But her eyes, those dark, haunted eyes, spoke volumes of endurance, of survival against odds that no one else could comprehend. I remember you," Cordelia whispered, voice brittle. Your father, you used to sit in the front pew." Sarah May's heart clenched. The memory of Reverend Whitfield's sermons, of gentle guidance, of quiet acts of compassion, filled her mind. "I remember you too," she said, stepping closer. "You taught Sunday school to the children. You were always kind, gentle, brave." Cordelia's lips trembled. "That was before they decided I was the devil's bride." Her voice cracked, and she lowered her knife slightly. "Before everything went wrong." Sarah May's chest tightened. She had spent 5 years running from grief, from memory, from questions about her father's death. And now, confronted with the terror and suffering etched on Cordelia's face, she realized the town's whispers had been lies, a web of cruelty spun to mask true horrors. "I'm here to help," Sarah May said, voice steadying. "Whatever happened, we will find the truth." Cordelia blinked, as if she hadn't believed kindness could exist in the hollow anymore. Slowly, she nodded. The tension in her body eased fractionally. Sarah May extended a hand, not commanding, but offering. Cordelia didn't take it immediately. Trust had been shattered too many times, but she let her hand hover in the space between them. A silent acknowledgement that perhaps someone still saw her as human. Outside, the first birds began their morning songs, but the forest and the hollow beyond still whispered of threats, lies, and secrets that had festered far too long. And Sarah May knew the fight for truth, for Cordelia's life, and for justice was only just beginning. The morning after her return, Sarah May made her way to her father's old house, a modest two-story structure that had stood untouched since Reverend Whitfield's death. Dust motes swirled in shafts of pale sunlight as she stepped through the doorway. each creak of the floorboards a reminder of a past she had long tried to leave behind. The scent of pipe tobacco, old books, and worn wood hung heavy in the air, a ghostly presence that made her throat tighten. Every surface was coated with the neglect of 5 years, but nothing was broken. Everything remained exactly as he had left it, and in that familiarity, Sarah May felt the weight of purpose pressing down upon her. She had to know, she had to understand what truly had happened to Cordelia and to her father. Her first steps led to the study, where rows of books leaned silently against one another on the shelves. Reverend Whitfield's journals, sermon notes, and letters cluttered the desk. Most were mundane matters of church life, prayers for the sick, plans for Sunday services, letters from parishioners. But beneath the surface, Sarah May sensed something darker, something buried. After several minutes of methodical searching, she discovered a small locked box beneath a false bottom of a desk drawer. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. The key, oddly enough, was still attached to her father's pocket watch, a small, deliberate clue, as though he had anticipated someone would one day need access. Inside were journals she had never seen, written in her father's careful hand, but revealing a side of him entirely different from the gentle preacher she remembered. These were chronicles of pain and injustice, accounts of women suffering silently while the men meant to protect them looked the other way. March 15, 1902, called to the Henderson place again today. Lucy's arm is broken this time, though she insists she fell down the stairs. The bruises on her throat tell a different story. Spoke to Sheriff Coleman about investigating, but he says a man's home is his castle, and the law has no place interfering between husband and wife. How many times must I hear those words? How many women must suffer while good Christian men look the other way? Entry after entry documented domestic violence, abuse hidden beneath the town's strict veneer of morality. Wives with blackened eyes, daughters sold too young, widows whose husbands died under suspicious circumstances that were never questioned. Sarah May's hands shook as she read, the pattern unmistakable. Sheriff Coleman had systematically blocked every attempt at justice. The later entries, from 1904 and 1905, chilled her more. They spoke in veiled terms of the horrors committed against women in the Hollow, men who were pillars of the community yet monsters behind closed doors. One name appeared repeatedly, Cordelia Thorne, September 3, 1904. Cordelia came to me after her first husband's death. Poor child, barely 20, already bearing scars no woman should endure. She begged me to help her escape before another man claimed her. But what power have I against the mine company and their arrangements? Isaac Dalton has already paid her father's debts and considers her part of the transaction. I fear what Thomas Brewer did to her was only the beginning. The weight of truth pressed down on Sarah May. Cordelia had been trapped, abused, sold from one cruel husband to the next. The town had vilified her, yet it was the men, the supposedly righteous, that had committed the true sins. Reverend Whitfield had known this, and his death had not been an accident, and now the burden of uncovering what he had hidden, of exposing the corruption that had consumed Blackwater Hollow, fell squarely upon Sarah May's shoulders. Sarah May closed the last journal entry with hands trembling, the words etched into her mind like fire on stone. The truth her father had spent years uncovering was worse than she had imagined. Cordelia had not been the monster the town whispered about. She had been the victim of relentless cruelty, forced into marriages she never consented to, her body and spirit violated by men shielded by wealth, influence, and the law. Her thoughts returned to Sheriff Buck Coleman, whose face haunted her still from the night of the mob. Cold, calculating, his authority wielded like a weapon against anyone daring to challenge the Hollow's twisted sense of justice. Every account her father had written, the accidents, the broken women, the hushed cries, pointed back to him. He had been at the center of it all. The next morning, determined to confront the institutional side of the horror, Sarah May made her way to the courthouse. Sunlight slanted weakly through the dusty windows, illuminating rows of shelves and boxes filled with records no one wanted examined. She approached the clerk's desk, her heart hammering. A shadow moved in the corner. "Sheriff Coleman, Miss Whitfield," he said, removing his hat in an almost polite gesture that barely masked the danger behind his eyes. "I heard you were back," stirring memories, poking into matters best left alone. "Some stones, you see, are safer unturned." Sarah May lifted her chin. "I have every right to examine the records. These files belong to the people." Coleman's smile was thin, humorless. "Delicate ladies like yourself aren't meant to handle what's inside, details of unnatural acts, madness, death. Surely you don't want your mind soiled." "I have a duty," she said steadily, though her pulse quickened. "A duty to the truth, and to Cordelia." Coleman stepped closer, whiskey on his breath, eyes gleaming with menace. "Your father thought the same, poor man. Always poking his nose where it didn't belong. Mining accidents. Terrible things, aren't they? A man minding his own business, suddenly at the bottom of a shaft. Tragic, and conveniently timed." Sarah May realized then that the danger she faced was not only personal, it was systematic. Every act, every lie, every rumor in Blackwater Hollow had been orchestrated to protect men like Coleman, to silence voices like her father's, and now she was the intruder, the one daring to challenge the Hollow's carefully constructed cruelty. She left the courthouse, hands clenched around the edges of her coat, thoughts spinning. The town had taught her a hard lesson. Truth could be more dangerous than lies, and the lies, carefully woven and endlessly repeated, had cost her father his life. Back in her father's old house, she felt the weight of journals pressing down upon her. Each word was a beacon, each hidden entry a map through a labyrinth of sin and oppression. And now, like her father before her, she had to find the courage to follow it. She could not confront Coleman directly. That path would lead only to death. Instead, she resolved to listen, observe, and gather the fragments of truth scattered among the women who had suffered in silence. Somewhere in the hollow, Cordelia awaited, her life and freedom tethered to Sarah May's courage. And Sarah May understood that uncovering the past would require patience, subtlety, and every ounce of strength she could summon. The fight for justice, for Cordelia, and for the truth of Blackwater Hollow was only beginning, and it would demand more than bravery. It would demand cunning, endurance, and the willingness to face horrors no one else dared speak aloud. Sarah May knew direct confrontation with Sheriff Coleman would be foolish. His authority, his menace, and the town's willingness to believe rumors over truth made it clear. She would need patience, subtlety, and allies she could trust. So she turned to the oldest residents of Blackwater Hollow, the women who had lived long enough to witness cruelty hidden behind polite facades. Her first visit was to Agnes McBride, a widow in her 70s who lived in a weathered cabin on the outskirts of town. Agnes had been her father's confidant, someone who had known both the preacher's secrets and the Hollow's dark undercurrents. The path to her cabin was overgrown, branches tugging at Sarah May's coat, and the air carried the earthy scent of autumn decay. Agnes opened the door before Sarah May could knock. Her eyes, clouded with age yet sharp with memory, narrowed as they recognized her. "You've come back," she said, voice both weary and wary. "Your father, he warned me this day might come." Sarah May stepped inside, the cabin smelling of herbs, smoke, and old wood. Agnes gestured toward a worn chair near the hearth. "Sit, speak softly. There are ears that hear even when the wind seems empty. I need to know the truth about Cordelia," Sarah May said gently, "about her husbands, about what happened, and why the town turned against her." Agnes's hands trembled slightly as she poured a cup of bitter tea. "Poor child," she whispered. "They say she drove 3 men to their graves, but that's not the truth, not by half. Your father knew it, and it's what got him killed." Sarah May's heart tightened. Then she wasn't the monster. Agnes shook her head. "No, she was a girl trapped in a nightmare. Thomas Brewer, her first husband, a mine foreman with violent rages, bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, men she couldn't escape. Isaac Dalton, the merchant, respectable to all eyes, but behind closed doors." Agnes's voice faltered. "He forced her into things no woman should endure, and when he died, well, they blamed her anyway. And the third husband," Sarah May asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Jeremiah Polk, Agnes said, eyes glimmering with anger. A land speculator, rich, connected, bought her like livestock to satisfy his debts, tortured her with his friends watching. No Christian woman should have lived through it. She didn't snap, she survived, that's all. Sarah May felt a mixture of relief and horror. Cordelia's reputation had been destroyed not by evil deeds, but by the cruelty and secrecy of men empowered by the town, the whispers, the sermons, the torchlit mobs. It had all been lies meant to mask the real monsters. Agnes leaned forward, her voice low. Your father left clues, journals, notes, hidden for someone who could see past the surface. You have the key, follow it. Protect her and be careful, Sheriff Coleman. He knows more than he should. He's dangerous. He'll do anything to keep the Hollow blind to the truth. Sarah May left the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. Each word from Agnes burned like coals in her mind. She now understood the depth of deception, the danger Cordelia had endured, and the role she must play. The Hollow was not just a town of superstition. It was a carefully constructed prison of lies, and she was about to step inside, armed with nothing but her father's words, her courage, and the knowledge that the truth could cost her life. Outside, the wind rattled the trees, carrying with it the echoes of fear, vengeance, and unspoken secrets. The Whitfield house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of the secrets stored within. Sarah May closed the door behind her and took a slow breath. Dust hung in the air, catching the pale sunlight in motes that seemed to dance like spirits of the past. Every step she took on the creaking floorboards echoed in the emptiness, a reminder that she was walking alone among the memories of a man who had devoted his life to uncovering the Hollow's hidden cruelties. She returned to her father's study, determined to comb through the journals once more. One box, previously overlooked, lay beneath the floorboard near the fireplace. Its lock was small, brittle with age, and gave way easily under her careful hands. Inside were letters, clipped from newspapers, reports of accidental deaths that had struck the Hollow over the past decade. Each one told a familiar story, men who had been cruel to women, miners who had fallen down shafts unfortunately, husbands who died suddenly. And the women left behind, whispered about but never believed. Sarah May's hands shook as she sorted through the papers. Her father had meticulously documented patterns, connections, and witnesses that no one else dared notice. Names appeared again and again: Isaac Dalton, Thomas Brewer, Jeremiah Polk, men of status, men protected by the town's silence, and each had a trail of suffering trailing behind them: bruised wives, daughters married too young, women trapped by circumstance and threat. A folded envelope marked in her father's hand caught her attention. Inside were confessions, hastily written from women who had survived the abuse. The words were raw, broken, yet resolute. He beat me, he humiliated me, he forced me. I tried to tell, but no one listened. One letter mentioned Cordelia Thorne by name, not as a monster, but as a girl forced into the darkest depths of cruelty. Reading them, Sarah May's stomach turned. She understood now why her father had died. He had tried to challenge the system, to expose the men whose reputations were untouchable, and in doing so, he had become a threat. The Hollow had protected itself by erasing the truth and branding Cordelia as the villain. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, a reminder that time in the Hollow moved slowly but with sharp, jagged edges. Sarah May folded the letters carefully, tucking them back into the envelope. Every story, every name, every small shred of truth mattered. They were pieces of a puzzle meant to reveal the Hollow's real face, but there was danger. Sheriff Coleman would not allow these truths to surface. He had warned her subtly the night she visited the courthouse. Accidents happen, he had said, to those who poke their noses where they do not belong. And now, armed with her father's evidence, Sarah May understood that the stakes were higher than ever. She paced the room, mind racing. How could she protect Cordelia, unearth the full extent of the Hollow's corruption, and survive herself? Each answer seemed just out of reach, hidden in shadows or whispered in voices too fearful to speak aloud. Finally, Sarah May made her choice. She would follow her father's path, slowly, carefully, listening, waiting, and when the time came, she would strike with the weight of truth behind her. The hollow had silenced many, but it had not yet silenced her. Sarah May understood that the truth she sought could not be wrested from the hollow in daylight. The town's eyes were everywhere, their whispers sharp as the frozen wind that cut through the ridges. So she moved carefully, retracing her father's footsteps, seeking those who had survived the hollow's cruelty yet lived to tell of it. Her first stop was the modest home of Eliza Carraway, a seamstress who had once labored for the wives of the wealthy, observing the world behind closed doors. Eliza opened the door cautiously, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Sarah May. "Your Reverend Whitfield's girl," she said, "come to stir trouble where none is wanted, no." Sarah May replied softly, holding her hands open, "I'm here to listen." To understand, to help. Eliza studied her for a long moment, then motioned her inside. The cabin smelled of fresh linen and wood smoke. Sunlight fell across a single table littered with scraps of fabric and small tools. Eliza gestured for Sarah May to sit. "The town thinks Cordelia Thorne did what she is accused of," she said, "but I saw the truth. I watched men who wore their respectability like armor do the unthinkable behind closed doors." Sarah May's heart pounded. Every story she had heard from Agnes McBride now found corroboration in Eliza's words. She leaned forward, listening, absorbing each detail. The cruelty of Thomas Brewer, the merciless control of Isaac Dalton, the humiliation inflicted by Jeremiah Polk. Eliza had seen it all, survived it all, and lived to tell the tale. They painted her as the monster. Eliza whispered, eyes darting to the window, as if the town's ears might be lurking just beyond the glass. "But she was a child trapped, always trapped. I saw the marks on her wrists, the bruises hidden beneath her sleeves. She cried silently while the men around her laughed, and the law did nothing." Sarah May felt the weight of her father's work pressing down on her again. Every journal entry, every hidden note, every whispered warning now made sense. Cordelia had been silenced, her reputation destroyed, and the true villains had continued walking free. "I have letters," Eliza said cautiously, producing a small bundle tied with a faded ribbon. "Women like me, we wrote what we could, hid it, for someone who would care enough to listen." Sarah May accepted the bundle with reverent hands. Inside were accounts of abuse, forced marriages, and threats, evidence painstakingly gathered by women who had survived unimaginable torment. Each page was a testament to the hollow's corruption, a map of the violence hidden beneath the town's pious facade. "We've lived in silence too long," Eliza said, voice trembling. "If you speak, they'll call you mad or worse. But if you don't, the truth dies with us." Sarah May nodded, understanding the enormity of what she held. She was no longer merely a visitor in Blackwater Hollow. She was the custodian of its secrets, the one charged with shining a light on the darkness men like Coleman had worked so hard to hide. Outside, the wind shifted again, a low moan threading through the trees, carrying with it the weight of the hollow's sins. Sarah May wrapped the letters close to her chest. The path ahead was dangerous, but the time for silence was over. Cordelia Thorne had survived the hollow. Now Sarah May would ensure the hollow survived truth. The days in Blackwater Hollow moved like shadows, long and oppressive, stretching across every street, every tree, and every wary gaze. Sarah May could feel the eyes of the town on her even when no one was near. Sheriff Buck Coleman had not forgotten her presence. She sensed it in the courthouse, in the shops, and even when she returned to her father's house. Every glance seemed calculated, every word from neighbors tinged with suspicion. She knew a direct confrontation would be reckless. Coleman was a man who had learned early how to manipulate fear, how to bend the law to his will, and how to ensure that whispers of truth never reached the ears of those who might act. He had silenced her father. He had orchestrated the lies that had haunted Cordelia, and he would stop at nothing to prevent Sarah May from exposing the hollow's corruption. For now, she focused on strategy. She began visiting the older women again, listening to the pauses in their speech, the words left unspoken. It was among these silences that the true stories emerged, fragments of events pieced together like broken glass. A door slammed where it shouldn't have, a husband seen in the shadows, the sound of crying muffled by laughter. Each detail, small yet vital, painted the hollow in stark, terrifying reality. That evening, as Sarah May returned to her father's house, she noticed something unusual. The front door, usually locked, had a faint scuff on the bottom edge. Her heart skipped a beat. Coleman's presence was never subtle, and he knew she was here. She entered carefully, moving toward the study. Nothing seemed disturbed, except a chair near the window was slightly shifted. Her father's journals were untouched, but the evidence of intrusion was clear. Someone had been inside, searching, perhaps hoping to erase what remained. Fear prickled along her spine, but Sarah May forced herself to remain calm. Panic would be exactly what Coleman wanted. She lit a small oil lamp and examined the room meticulously, checking for missing papers, hidden letters, or anything that could reveal her next steps. Everything appeared intact. Still, the warning was unmistakable. She was being watched. Every move, every conversation, every step through the hollow carried risk. Determined, she began planning her next course of action. Cordelia's safety remained paramount. The letters, the hidden accounts, the journals, all of it had to be preserved. Coleman's threat was silent but omnipresent. Any overt act of defiance could lead to tragedy, just as it had for her father. She thought back to Reverend Whitfield's last words in his journal. Sometimes the truth is worth dying for. Sarah May felt the weight of that truth pressing on her shoulders. To expose Coleman, to vindicate Cordelia, to restore justice to the hollow, she would have to move with the cunning and patience her father had employed. One wrong step could cost her everything. Outside, the wind swept across the ridge, rattling the windows and stirring the shadows. In the distance, the faint echo of church bells carried, a reminder that the town still clung to its moral illusions. But Sarah May knew better. Beneath the piety, beneath the sermons, lay a network of corruption and fear. She sat at her father's desk, gathering the letters and notes, her resolve hardening. The hollow had silenced many. It had crushed lives and twisted truths. But Sarah May was determined. She would not be silenced. And she would ensure that Cordelia Thorne finally had her story told. Sarah May understood that truth alone was not enough in Blackwater Hollow. The town had been built on whispers, half-truths, and the careful manipulation of fear. Every stone on Main Street, every shuttered window, every nod in passing carried a story, but most were lies. Lies designed to protect men like Sheriff Buck Coleman, men who wielded power like a weapon and silenced anyone brave enough to speak. Her investigation now took on the meticulous patience of a spider weaving a web. She moved quietly through the hollow, under the guise of a returning daughter and concerned parishioner, listening for cracks in the town's carefully constructed narrative. She visited old shops, the chapel, even the abandoned cabins along the ridge. Everywhere, she sensed hesitation, the way people's eyes shifted, the subtle tone changes when Cordelia's name arose. Agnes McBride's warnings echoed in her mind. Follow the truth carefully. Watch the silences, they tell more than the words. Sarah May had learned that the real story lay not in what was said, but in the spaces between the pauses, the glances, the unspoken acknowledgments of wrongs no one dared name aloud. Her first breakthrough came when she overheard two men speaking outside the general store, voices low but urgent. "She's back." One said, "Best keep your mouths shut, sheriff's watching." The other nodded, unease etched in his features. They didn't notice Sarah May lurking behind the barrels. She caught the words, their fear, their complicity. Every detail she gathered, no matter how small, was another thread in the web of truth. By nightfall, she returned to her father's house, letters and journals tucked carefully beneath her cloak. Candlelight flickered across the room, shadows dancing along the walls. The hollow itself seemed to pulse with expectation, as if the mountains were waiting for justice to awaken. Sarah May knew she was not merely piecing together a story. She was unraveling the fabric of a town built on cruelty, secrecy, and corruption. She spread the letters on the desk, reading them once more, noting connections she had missed before. Patterns emerged, the accidental deaths, the husbands with hidden appetites, the women silenced, the law complicit. Cordelia's story was only one of many, yet it had become the focal point, a symbol for the broader injustice festering in the hollow. Sarah May's resolve hardened. She would not allow the town to continue its cycle of lies. She would protect Cordelia, expose Coleman, and reveal the hidden truths the hollow had tried to bury. But she understood the danger. Coleman would act swiftly, decisively, and ruthlessly to prevent exposure. Her father's voice, echoing from the journals, became a guiding presence. Sometimes the truth is worth dying for, and now that choice was Sarah May's. Every step forward carried risk, yet she could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She was the last hope for those silenced, the custodian of secrets too dangerous for ordinary eyes. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters and stirred the skeletal branches of the trees. The hollow's shadows seemed to shift and wait, watching her, testing her resolve. Sarah May sat at the desk, quill in hand, ready to record, to connect, to prepare the evidence that could finally bring justice to Cordelia Thorne. The hollow would not stay silent forever. Sarah May could feel the hollow tightening around her like a noose. Each step she took toward uncovering the truth seemed to stir the shadows, sending whispers racing through the town like wildfire. Sheriff Buck Coleman's presence was everywhere, silent and suffocating, a reminder that the hollow's corruption extended far beyond the streets she walked. He was the gatekeeper of lies, and she had become an intruder in his carefully maintained world. She spent the following days moving discreetly between the women who had survived the hollow's cruelty, gathering testimonies and accounts with painstaking care. Each woman offered fragments of the past, bruises hidden beneath sleeves, husbands' rages concealed behind polite manners, the quiet terror of forced compliance. These stories were the puzzle pieces that, when combined with her father's journals, revealed the true scale of the hollow's darkness. Cordelia Thorne remained at the edge of the town, in the old Thorne cottage, scarred and wary but alive. Sarah May visited her under the pretense of friendly concern, but her real purpose was to offer guidance, protection, and reassurance. Cordelia's eyes, haunted yet sharp, betrayed the knowledge that she had survived horrors no one else could imagine. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that someone, finally, was on her side. Even as the women shared their accounts, Sarah May could feel the tension thickening. The hollow was a powder keg, and Sheriff Coleman had the match. His warnings, subtle yet menacing, had left no room for doubt. The path she had chosen was fraught with danger. She could not confront him directly, not yet. Patience, cunning, and strategy were her only weapons against the web of power he wielded. That evening, as the autumn sun dipped behind the granite peaks, Sarah May returned to her father's study to review her notes. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, as if the hollow itself were alive, watching, waiting. She laid out the journals, letters, and witness accounts across the desk, piecing together a timeline, connecting the deaths of Cordelia's husbands and identifying patterns of abuse that Coleman had systematically ignored or concealed. Her mind raced. She could see the outline of the truth emerging from the shadows, a picture so damning that it would shake the hollow to its core. But she also knew that once she moved, once the evidence was revealed, the full force of the town's power would descend upon her. Coleman would act swiftly, and there would be no turning back. Yet Sarah May could not falter. The hollow had consumed too many lives, silenced too many voices, and let too much evil flourish. Cordelia's suffering had been endless, and her father had paid the ultimate price for seeking justice. Now the responsibility had passed to her. As night fell, she gathered the letters and journals, hiding them carefully beneath her cloak. The wind continued to wail, carrying the echoes of past horrors and future reckoning. Sarah May's jaw tightened with determination. The hollow would soon learn that its shadows could not hide the truth forever, and that the reckoning, long delayed, was finally approaching. The final night before Sarah May intended to act, Blackwater Hollow seemed to hold its breath. The town was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as though the mountains themselves had drawn a heavy curtain over the hollow, hiding the truth yet warning of the storm to come. She moved carefully through the streets, letters and journals secured beneath her cloak, each step deliberate and measured. Cordelia's cottage lay at the edge of the forest, dark and nearly invisible against the dense shadows of the pines. Sarah May approached cautiously, mindful of every creak of the floorboards and snap of a branch underfoot. Inside, Cordelia was awake, sitting by a candle's faint glow, her hands resting on her knees, eyes haunted but alert. "You came," Cordelia whispered, voice barely audible. "I did," Sarah May replied, kneeling beside her. "We're ready. The truth will be heard, and it will reach beyond this hollow. No one can bury it this time." Cordelia's lips trembled in a small, fragile smile. "I've waited so long, they tried to destroy you," Sarah May said gently. "But they cannot destroy what is real. Your story is yours to tell, and now we have proof: your husband's crimes, Sheriff Coleman's corruption, the town's lies. It all ends tonight." Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the echo of centuries of silence and fear. Sarah May knew that confronting Coleman directly would be dangerous, but she had spent months gathering evidence, speaking with the Hollow's women, piecing together accounts that would leave no room for denial. The time for caution had ended. They made their way to the courthouse at first light. Sarah May carried the letters and journals, her hands steady, her resolve ironclad. Cordelia followed, shadowed yet unbroken, her presence a silent testament to survival. When the courthouse doors opened, the town seemed to hold its collective breath. Whispers rippled through the room, faces turned pale, eyes widened. Sheriff Buck Coleman appeared from the back office, his expression calm, almost amused, until he saw Sarah May. The confidence drained from him as the weight of exposure loomed. He had underestimated the courage of a woman armed with truth, and the memory of a father who refused to let injustice stand. Sarah May laid out the evidence meticulously, each letter, each journal entry, each testimony connecting the dots of corruption, abuse, and lies. Gasps filled the room as the hidden history of Blackwater Hollow unfolded. The town could no longer pretend ignorance. Cordelia stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "I am not the monster you have whispered about. I survived. And now, justice will finally see the light." The courtroom trembled with tension, and for the first time in decades, the Hollow felt the weight of truth pressing upon it. The shadows of fear and lies were pierced by courage and evidence. Coleman's authority crumbled under the revelations, and women who had endured in silence were finally heard. Sarah May stood beside Cordelia, knowing that the path ahead would still be dangerous, but certain that the Hollow's power had shifted. The truth, long buried, could not be undone. Outside, the autumn sun rose over the ridges, casting long golden streaks across the Hollow. The mountains seemed to exhale, releasing centuries of held breath. The Hollow would never be the same. Sarah May and Cordelia walked together through the quiet streets, the letters and journals now safe in their hands. The reckoning had come, and justice, long delayed, was finally within reach. The Hollow would remember this day.